So our next speaker is Cary Kopczynski, our past president and president and founder of CKC, who is one of our best proponents of constructability and productivity in design and construction. So,
well, thank you very much, Oscar, and thank you also, Jim. You know, I served most of my presidential term in COVID lockdown. I was never quite sure the impact I was having, if any, because we were all locked up in COVID, right? And it's nice to know that at least one person read my presidential memos. So way to go, Jim. Thank you very much. It's good to see. So Bruce, you know, I started hearing a lot about Bruce Supernaut many years ago and never really got to know him until fairly recently. But I heard so much, especially from contractors, about Bruce. Let's check with Bruce. Let's see what Bruce says. Let's find something Bruce wrote and see if it corroborates, Cary, what you're saying. And I think, God, who is this guy? You know, I began to think that maybe he's the exception to the rule that we all put our pants on one leg at a time. I thought maybe he's got some gymnastic move where he just jumps and boom, he's got his pants on. I mean, it was pretty amazing when I began to hear about Bruce. And as I've gotten to know him just a little bit better, it's clear to me that everything I heard was well-grounded and said for a reason. He truly has been an icon in the industry, and especially in his connection between designers and contractors, which is what I'll be talking about. So with that, let me begin with the story. I'm going to talk about why ACI is placing focus on productivity, constructability and productivity. Coincidentally, a couple of months ago, an article appeared in the New York Times, and I'm not going to make any political comments about the New York Times because we all know that it has taken its share of criticism over the last 5 or 6 years. However, I happen to think it's a pretty good newspaper, and I do read it. And this article appeared a couple of months ago on a Sunday, very long story, about the story that construction tells about America's economy. And the essence of the story was that construction is a strange industry because whereas the productivity in construction starting after World War II improved rapidly, actually faster than the general economy, until the 1970s and 1980s, something happened in the 1980s that caused construction productivity to go on a long glide slope, and it landed about where it took off in 1947. So think about that for a moment. If you go all the way back to right after World War II, if you were to look at the value created per unit of time, which is the definition of productivity, how much value does a worker create per unit of time, typically 1 hour? If you look at the value created in 1947 versus the value creation today, and I'm talking about the entire industry, not just the people in the field, but our industry in general, we are today where we were in 1947. That's pretty astonishing, and that's the essence of what this article said, that there's something wrong with what we're doing in the world of construction in terms of improving productivity. Let me go to another story or another report that came out in February of 2017. I think most of you are probably familiar with this. If not, you can find it online, and it's well worth your time to read it. So McKinsey, the McKinsey Global Institute, did a deep dive into our industry, construction, not just concrete, but the construction industry in general. They went to 41 countries around the world, and they compiled data. And the data they compiled was relative to, is construction productivity improving or not? And they wrote a report that was issued around the world and is still available today. What they said was very similar to what the New York Times said. And I'll read this. Even while other sectors from retail to manufacturing have transformed their efficiency, boosted their productivity, and embraced the digital age, construction appears to be stuck in a time warp. So construction is stuck in a time warp. Not a real flattering comment for the industry we're all part of. Now, there is a bright side to this. They came out with a number of recommendations on what we can all do to fix this and improve it. But the fact is that something has gone wrong. This graph actually says it all. If you look at the overall rate of productivity improvement, which is the navy line, down there at the bottom, navy colored line, overall productivity has been on a steady upslope since 1947. If you look at construction, however, we actually outpaced overall productivity until about 1970. And then something happened, and we began to falter, and we've been on a glide slope down ever since. So we have ended. Now, this goes out through 2010. If you take it from 2010 till today, there actually has been some improvement, not a lot, but a little. But the bottom line is that relative to other industry, manufacturing, wholesale and retail, agriculture especially, agriculture because of chemical fertilizers that created astonishing improvement in yields, but the overall productivity has steadily grown and construction has not. So what that says is that we need to do something to address this problem. In my year as president, I actually, prior to becoming president, decided to focus on this because I'd become aware of it, and I've seen it in my own practice for years and years and years, just the disconnect between design and construction. Not always, there are exceptions. I've done work with some of the folks that Jim referenced in his talk. I mean, there are bright spots out there where true collaboration begins early, and designers and contractors, builders sit down in a spirit of cooperation and collaboration, and they work together to talk about how we're going to build the building before we design the building. That does happen, but not very often. More commonly, as Jim referenced, there's a gag order put on the communication. AIA documents actually have language that says if I'm working for the architect, which we don't always do, but we do on a lot of our work, that once we sign that agreement, once I sign the agreement, I'm to communicate only with the architect and not with the contractor. Now think about that. How silly is that? How crazy is that really? So the people building the building, the people who are actually building what I design, I can't communicate with unless I filter it through somebody else. That's crazy in my mind. That's crazy. But let me continue. So the McKinsey gave recommendations on how we can fix this problem, the McKinsey report. They began by saying we need to improve the constructability of design. So by constructability, they were using the commonly used definition, which I think all of us are aware of. But if not, what constructability means is that when we're designing something, we are cognizant and aware of the way it's going to be built so that we can make decisions with that awareness. In other words, we can incorporate construction knowledge into what we design. So for example, we're aware of the fact that formwork is very expensive. And because formwork is very expensive, we don't change column sizes every floor. We try to pick 3 or 4 column sizes that work for the project and keep them constant. Because if you change the column size every floor just to save a little concrete, you're throwing a lot of money away and a lot of time. Things like that. That's constructability. And they suggested that we put more focus on improving that. They said embrace innovation. They said your industry seems very choked up with risk management, where because we're all concerned about litigation and lawsuits, and we pay a lot of money for insurance, which I can relate to because I've been writing E&O payment checks for a long time, and they're not cheap. But because we have this mindset of litigation awareness and concern, we make decisions differently, and we tend to resist innovation, not because we don't believe in it, but because it's something new and different that might get us in trouble. So embrace innovation. They said reshape regulation. They said your industry has choked itself up with too many rules. I have a talk I've given, I won't do it here today, but I call it rules versus plays. Actually, the president's memo I wrote, rules versus plays. We as an industry and as an institute are very, very good, probably the best in the world, arguably, at writing really good rule books. 318, 301, 350, we write really good rule books, the best. We're not as good, in my opinion, at training designers to run the plays. We don't run the plays as well as we write the rules. Now imagine if you took a group of umpires, let's say football referees. So we take a bunch of referees and we suit them up in pads and helmets. They know the rule. They know every rule in the book. That's why they're referees, right? We put them on the field and match them up against a good team. Who wins the game? The players don't know the rules as well. They have a good working understanding of the rules. The referees know them all, every comma, every period. But who wins the game? The players, right? So understanding rules is important, but understanding the rules does not necessarily make you a good player. You can have a really good understanding. You can memorize 318, have it memorized, every sentence, every comma, every period, and still not be a good designer. So we need to focus more on less on writing good rule books and more on training players to play the game. They said we should rewire contracts. They said that our industry has disproportionate risk sharing. So general contractors, if they've been in business very long, get really, really good at pushing risk off into their material suppliers and their subcontractors, and some of you I'm sure can relate to this, where the risk gets pushed off to everybody but them, and what they do is manage the contracts. That's why they're contractors. So they become, and I know we have, I don't want to insult anybody here, so I won't use any names, but what happens is we spend so much time trying to push risk around, and we do it in a disproportionate way that we hamstring the industry. They said we should improve procurement and supply chains. They said we should improve on-site execution. And then finally, they said we should reskill workers. So this is what McKinsey came up with in their report. I'm going to focus primarily on the very top bullet, because that's where I live and breathe and work. As a designer, I'm a structural engineer based in Seattle with a Chicago office as well. But I work in the world of design, and I have seen over and over and over again projects where if there had been more focus on better constructability by the design team, you would have had a better outcome. So, what is the ACI response to the McKinsey report and this issue of productivity? And Bruce, I'm hoping this is near and dear to your heart. I know that every time I spoke with Bev, because I worked with her quite a bit in preparing some of these things, she would defer to you. I've got to talk to Bruce. I've got to talk to Bruce. I've got to talk to Bruce. So a lot of what I'm doing here is just channeling Bruce. But ACI's response was we had a Strategic Development Council meeting that we called Productivity in Concrete Construction. It was a workshop in February of 2020. That happened to be about 2 weeks before the COVID lockdown. Little did we know at the time, we were all down in Charleston, and we had a great meeting with 20 plus people, 25 maybe, including the McKinsey people. We had some of the McKinsey folks in the meeting, and we talked for a full day about what could ACI do to address this problem. And after Charleston, a number of us continued to meet as the productivity posse. We decided there was real merit in continuing on with our discussions and trying to create some real actionable items that we could help move the industry forward with. So we called ourselves the Productivity Posse. That went on for quite a while, 6 or 8 months. And then that led to the formation of an ACI task group, which I chaired because I was vice president at the time. And we developed recommendations that ACI could use to improve constructability and productivity. So that's the backdrop of what we did. The board task group, here's the band of thieves that did all the work. You recognize a lot of these people, I'm sure, and I won't go through all their names, but this task group met for 6 or 8 months before we prepared recommendations to the board, and the recommendations that we gave the board were that ACI should begin doing training on constructability, number one. We should develop some sort of feedback loop to ACI committees, primarily 318, which we now have put in place almost. We have the committee formed and populated, and that committee will begin this year to review code change proposals coming out of 318. In fact, Oscar is chairing that committee. And the idea with that committee will be that they will review change proposals coming out of 318 subcommittees. At the same time they're going to the main committee, they're going through a constructability feedback loop. The Constructability Review Committee will inform the 318 members of the impact to the industry if they execute that change. So if one of the subcommittees is proposing some change to the building code, it goes off to the main committee. It also goes through a constructability feedback loop. The constructability people inform the 318 members of what happens to the industry if you do this. It'll be a non-binding recommendation. So people who are on 318 or familiar with what 318 does, and I served on that committee for many years and know full well that they need to have control over their own document. That's mandatory. So this is going to be non-binding feedback that goes to 318 members. They can do with it what they want. If they choose to ignore it, they have that right. But the hope is, and we think this will happen, they will review the material in the spirit that it's offered. And the spirit that it's offered is to assist the industry move forward with productivity improvement. That's the intent. So, engineer field training. This one we don't have a lot of meat on the bone yet, but the thinking is that we can find a way as an industry to get engineers out in the field more often. One of the ways we can do that is work through our chapters. We have, as we all know, chapters active all over the country, all over the world. We can encourage chapters to focus on really interesting and successful projects active in their market area and potentially sponsor field visits. And they encourage engineering offices to send their people, and maybe this is a once-a-month activity, but maybe once a month each chapter has identified a project that's very important, it's proceeding in a different way, or it's just a very successful example of collaboration. And they encourage design offices to send their people and take a 2-hour tour. So you take a visit of a job site. A lot of young design engineers very seldom get out in the field. They just don't. I see some heads nodding. They don't go in the field. You know, it seems axiomatic to me, because that's the way I started my career, was I spent a lot of time out in the field, and I wanted to hear from the rebar placer. Tell me what you like and what you don't. I really want to know. The details that we drew, they worked really well on paper, and they look great on paper. What do you think about how they're executed in the field? And sometimes I'd get the most shocking feedback. Some of the stuff that I thought was really awkward and complicated, they had no problem with. But oftentimes the details that they have the most trouble with are the ones that occur hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times, like a typical slab edge, or a typical fit-up detail of a slab to a wall, or the typical details that get used hundreds of times on a job. If you can save even 10 minutes with one of those details, and you do it hundreds of times, that's the kind of feedback that engineers need. So we want to encourage them to get out in the field more. We talked about doing a constructability index. We don't have much meat on the bone here either, but the basic idea was that similar to what Leeds did, where you score buildings for sustainability and you get a point total, the thought was if we could do something similar for constructability, where, and actually Singapore has done this, interestingly enough. We talked about this in our productivity posse for months, and one day we're informed by somebody who just went on Google and discovered that Singapore did this years ago, and they have a constructability review of every project. So if you build a building in Singapore, you get rated on the constructability of your design before that building is built, and you get a score. And the thought was if we could somehow daylight to conscious awareness the constructability of designs, and we do that in a spirit of cooperation, not threat. We don't want to threaten people, but if we can do it in a helpful way and inform designers of the constructability of what they're doing, that would be an asset to the industry. So stand by on that, because that we don't have much meat on the bone yet. And then finally, we talked about starting an ACI Center of Excellence for the purpose of advancing productivity and constructability. If you're not familiar with that, let me give you a brief summary of how that works. We do have 3 centers now. We have Next, New, and Pro. Pro is the most recent. And the idea with the Centers of Excellence is they're independent of ACI, but part of ACI. So if you think of ACI as an umbrella, ACI is the big umbrella. Under that umbrella, we have 3 different centers that are operating independently, but they benefit from the global outreach that ACI can provide. So they're separate 501c3 organizations. The really distinct feature of the centers is that they have a laser focus on a specific industry target, and that allows them to move quickly. So they're fast and they're focused. They're fast and they're focused. They're fast because they're not encumbered by ACI bylaws. They have their own mission, vision, values, leadership. They employ their own people. They have a laser focus on a specific industry target, and they do not have to follow the consensus-based process that ACI follows. So they can move quickly. The members are primarily corporations and nonprofits who provide the financial support. So they are not funded by ACI. So your dues to ACI, with the exception of the original seed money that helped get each center underway, the idea is they become self-sustaining with their own membership. And ACI will provide and does provide services to each center. So for example, if NEX or NEW or PRO is now active and underway, if they need marketing help, for example, they go down the hall and they talk to the ACI marketing team. And the ACI marketing team does some work for PRO and then sends them a bill. And PRO pays the bill. So if PRO wants the services of ACI, they pay for it. And that is a very symbiotic and value-added way to operate. And then finally, the centers, as they issue help to the industry, documents, reports, and so forth, they have the option of co-branding with ACI or not, at their choice. So they can choose to put the NEX logo and the ACI logo on their documents or not. It'll be their choice. If they think co-branding has benefit, they'll go ahead and do that. If they think it is unnecessary, they won't. So the way that looks in terms of a diagram, here's our first center of excellence. So NEX in the lower right, ACI up top. It's very, very simple. They're separate, and yet they work together. So they're two independent organizations, and they're symbiotic because of their joint activities. Our second center was NEW. This is for carbon neutrality. And the really powerful feature, in my mind, of NEW, there are a lot of people now working in the sustainability space. We all know that. We have PCA, we have steel organizations, everybody is working in sustainability. Most of them, though, are geographically limited. They are limited to North America or Western Europe or the Middle East or South America, just the nature of the association doing the work. ACI, on the other hand, has global reach because we have partnerships in, I think, about 60 countries now. We have membership in over 100 countries. So ACI is really the only organization in the concrete industry capable of reaching around the world with our work. And we all know that once carbon goes into the atmosphere, it doesn't obey any borders, right? Carbon that is emitted in the U.S. doesn't stay in the U.S. It can travel around the world. So carbon neutrality is a global problem, and it needs a global solution. ACI can provide that. So NEW, I think, has real potential to make a big impact quickly. And then finally, PRO, this is our most recent center, and this is focused on improving constructability and productivity. And we have hired, well, before I get to that, let me talk about the PRO vision. Our vision is a concrete industry where the productivity potential of contemporary materials and construction systems is fully realized and continually advanced. Very simple. That's our vision. And our mission is to collaborate. The very first word in the mission statement, collaborate with designers, material suppliers, builders, and other industry stakeholders to continually improve the constructability of design and the productivity of construction for concrete structures of all types. So that's where the vision comes down to ground, and we actually have actionable words in our mission that create the compass heading. That's the compass heading for what PRO is all about. And we've hired Phil DeKemper. I'm sure a lot of you know Phil. He was with SECO for, gosh, I think about 40 years. Is Phil here? I don't think Phil is here. We have a session on this tomorrow. In fact, I'm doing a similar presentation tomorrow. But, and you're all very welcome between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. tomorrow. We're doing a panel discussion, 2 hours, talking about PRO. We're going to have 7 panelists, owners, concrete people, contractors, material suppliers, and talking about where we go with PRO. 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. tomorrow. We'd love to see you there. But Phil DeKemper has been hired as our executive director. So he is our, he is at the moment our leader. We hope he stays with us for at least a few years, which I'm sure he will. I know he's quite excited about this, and he believes, as I do, that given the vast resources of ACI and the horsepower of ACI around the world, that we can truly make a difference with what we're doing here, and that is our goal. ACI has talked about, since I've been in ACI for 35 years, a little more than that, we've been kicking the idea of productivity around and constructability with committees and all sorts of initiatives, and none of it really stuck the way we had hoped. I think now we finally, given the fact we have this new entity, can make a big difference. So that's the end of my presentation. Are we taking questions now or later? No questions? All right, good. Thank you very much.